It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. This is a famous quote from a novel by Jane Austen, who was one of Britain's most famous authors. She was writing in the period in history known as the Regency Era, so her books were written in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. She lived in Bath for a while and set two of her famous novels here, so we're here to explore the city and find out more about who Jane was and what she did. So come join us on our adventure.
Jane Austen was born in Steventon in Hampshire on the 16th of December 1775, and she was the seventh of 8 children. It's said that she had a happy but busy upbringing. We're going to talk to Dr. Lizzie Rogers to find out more about her childhood.
I'm Dr. Lizzie Rogers and I'm a historian of women's lives in the 18th and early 19th century.
So you're the perfect person to tell us about Jane Austen's childhood. What would that have been like?
So Jane Austen, I think by all accounts, had a great childhood. She grew up at Steventon in Hampshire, which isn't too far from Bath. And she grew up one of 8 children, a lively family where they were encouraged to read, to write, to do plays. In the evenings, they would get together, they would kind of act out dramatic things. They would run around Steventon. Her father was the rector at the church there. So that was where their lives would have been centred around. And she spent the first 25 years of her life there. So it would have been a very happy childhood. And her nephew once said that it was the cradle of her genius. So really what brought her to life was in Steventon.
Well, that's good to know. It's good to know she had a nice upbringing. And how would that compare to other children in the Georgian era?
So the Austen family, although they were kind of culturally rich, they weren't the most well off. So they kind of sat between really rich children, really kind of poor children. So rich children probably would have had a lot more access to things like books, to toys, to schooling. But poorer children would have probably spent more time with their families, a little bit like the Austens did with each other, because they wouldn't have had a nanny, they wouldn't have had a governess and people like that looking after them, but also less opportunity to attend school and things like that. So childhood could really vary in this period in history, and Jane Austen kind of got the best of both worlds, but also sat in between.
So you mentioned schooling. Did Jane go to school at all?
She did. Briefly. So Jane went to school firstly in 1783 with her older sister Cassandra. So Jane and Cassandra were best friends for their whole lives. And Jane was only 7 years old, Cassandra was 10, so Jane was a little bit too young to go, but apparently she wouldn't do anything without her sister, so they went together. They went to the boarding school of a relation along with their cousin Jane Cooper. Unfortunately, all 3 of them got very, very ill and were quickly sent home, but then they went back to boarding school in Reading at the Abbey School from 1785 to 87. So she only spent about 3 years or so at school, which is kind of astonishing for us to think about now, what she achieved.
It really is, actually.
Yeah.
And would most other children have gone to schools? What would that have been like?
So it really varied, again, depending on whether you're a rich child, whether you're a poor child, and also on whether you're a boy or a girl. Boys spent a lot more time at school if their parents were rich enough to send them to school. They also learn a lot different subjects to girls. So if you were kind of relatively well off, and even at probably Jane's station, you would have learned things like music, potentially some languages, you would have read, you would have learnt needlework, things that were meant to prepare you to kind of be good in managing a household. Whereas boys learnt things like science, like maths, things that we probably recognise more at school today, and they could go to university. So if your parents really valued girls getting educated, you would get more opportunities, but if they didn't, then you probably wouldn't. So there was lots of variables about school in this time.
Could you tell us any more about Jane's family life?
Yes, so Jane was one of 8 children, one of only 2 girls, so she had many brothers running around. One of her brothers, George, suffered from some kind of disability, so he lived with a local family to be cared for. Another of her brothers, Edward, was actually adopted by wealthy relations, so he became Edward Austen Knight. So there were lots of them running around at home, and actually her father, the Reverend George Austen, he tutored local boys from richer families, and this meant he had a great library that he really enjoyed, and he let all his children into it. So although Jane only spent 3 years or so at school, she spent a lot of time reading widely in his library, and that would have been really rare for a girl to have that opportunity. So her and Cassandra did a lot of that along with her brothers, and they spent a lot of time learning and talking together as well.
We're going to explore Jane's famous books. They tell us a lot about the Regency period she was writing in, and especially a lot about women at this time. Jane Austen wrote 6 books in her lifetime, but 2 were published after her death, and one novel, Sanditon, remained unfinished before her death as she grew too weak to hold a pen. Jane's brother, Henry, helped her negotiate deals with publishers to get her books published. Prince Regent George IV had copies of Jane's books in all of his residences, but even with this fame, she didn't actually make much money from her books, and she still had to rely on her male family members. Sanditon was Jane Austen's unfinished novel. But Sense and Sensibility was the first novel that Jane Austen published in 1811. It was originally written as Eleanor and Marianne, but the title changed to Sense and Sensibility. It was probably written as early as 1795. Pride and Prejudice is arguably Jane Austen's most famous novel. It was published in 1813, but as with all of Jane's other novels, it was published anonymously, written by a lady. Pride and Prejudice was originally called First Impressions, and it's believed she began writing it in 1796. Mansfield Park was published in 1814, and Emma was published in 1816. Persuasion and Northanger Abbey was published posthumously, which means after Jane died. They were published in 1818. Persuasion was originally called The Elliots and was written between 1815 and 1816. And Northanger Abbey was originally called Susan, and it was written in 1797. But I think we should talk to an expert about Jane's books. So we're going to go talk to Izzy.
Hi Izzy, so nice to speak to you. So would you be able to tell us a little bit more about what Jane's books are about?
Yes, of course. So Jane Austen's novels, she has 6 completed ones in total, and they tend to revolve around romance and marriage. So they follow the heroine, the protagonist of the book, on their journey, and that journey tends to end with them marrying the worthy suitor of the novels. However, her books do focus on other things as well, and one of those being society and also community. So Jane had a really keen eye for understanding the way that people think and act, and she used that to actually create her characters. So she would observe the people around her, their personalities, and she would build her characters from that. And so this is why her characters are so relatable today. Everybody knows a Mr. Collins type character from Pride and Prejudice, and people find a lot of resonance with characters like Elizabeth Bennet as well. So yeah, these were characters who were created from real people that she encountered in her life.
And why is it that Jane's books are so famous?
So one of the main reasons why Jane Austen's work is so famous is because she has unforgettable love stories. In fact, many of our modern romances, and particularly the tropes of modern romances, are shaped by Jane Austen. So if you think about things like enemies to lovers, friends to lovers, these were very much popularized by Jane Austen's work. So Friends to Lovers really relates to Emma, say, where Emma eventually realizes her feelings for Mr. Knightley, who's been a lifelong friend. And Enemies to Lovers very much relates to Pride and Prejudice, in how Elizabeth Bennet goes from really disliking Mr. Darcy to actually falling in love with him. So we still see these themes play out in books and movies today. So her legacy is really lived on in all forms of media. So her stories also really connect across generations, because they're also really funny and they reflect real life. So I think they really draw readers in because of that.
And what do these books tell us about the time period in England that she was writing in?
So one of the first ways, if we look in particular at the book Northanger Abbey, this one was written partially as a way to defend the novel as a literary form. So at the time, the novel was kind of considered a silly form of writing, like not something to be taken seriously. And Jane Austen writes Northanger Abbey, and in that she writes a whole section where she defends the novel, where she says why the novel is so important and why it's enjoyed by both men and women. There was this idea that if women were enjoying novels, it was actually causing them to be silly in their own life, because of the stories that were in these books. However, Jane Austen says, this isn't the case. These books are wonderful, and this is my preferred way to write as well. And she really encouraged people to both read novels and for them to write them as well. The next way that Jane Austen's books tell us about the time period is it really showcases how people cared a lot about status and class at the time. So Austen's books really do highlight how society was working in the 19th century. And at the time, it was very important to be seen with the right people and to be seen in the right places. It was very much a hierarchy of status, and appearances and who you were friends with really mattered. And so Jane Austen really highlights this in her books and how this could have been a real struggle for people, meeting the right friends and also marrying the right people. So it's very much so her books very much showcase what it was like to live in small communities, like in Emma, where you live in a small town and you're all trying to get along, but also what it was like to be in, wider networks, like in Bath or in London. So I think she showcases what it was like to be a young person navigating the world and trying to make friends and find someone to marry. And then the last one really just link into that is that at the time there was what they called the marriage market. So unfortunately for women, the only way that you could really secure your lifestyle was to marry someone with money. It was near impossible for women to get jobs and make their own income. Jane Austen herself was a bit of an anomaly in this because she wrote and actually was paid for her writing. Not very well, I will say. But women making money was very unusual at the time, making their own money. And so they needed to marry well to survive. And so what often happened is women would need to go to popular locations like Bath and London so that they could interact and find wealthy men to marry. And so Jane Austen really showcases this, but also what she says is it is important to be comfortable in life as a woman, but it is more important to marry somebody that you love. And that was actually quite... that notion, marrying for love, was becoming more and more common at the time. However, arranged marriages and people unfortunately being, coerced or forced into marriages was still very common. And so Austen was kind of a pioneer in encouraging women to hold out and marry people that they loved.
Now you know a bit more about Jane's books, let's go and find out about her lifestyle.
Information on Jane's personal life comes from letters or sketches written by her family members, but only 160 of the 3,000 letters she wrote to her sister Cassandra still survive, because Cassandra burned them so that people couldn't read the information in them. She didn't want any of her younger nieces to read the sometimes acid or forthright opinions Jane had on her neighbours or family members. But in other letters she wrote to Cassandra about going around the Royal Crescent for some fresh air, or about how great Sally Lunn's buns were. The first place that Jane lived while in Bath was 4 Sydney Place, and they moved multiple times before finally relocating just down there at 25 Gage Street. We are here at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath, and one of our experts is going to tell us what her life was like while she was here.
Of course. So Jane relocated here in the year of 1801. She moved with her father, mother and sister Cassandra. So they lived in around 7 to 8 locations whilst they were living here in Bath. They did live on this exact street. We are in the building of 40 Gay Street. She lived up the street number 25. So she lived there for a few months. That is now a dentist, sadly, and a lot of the locations in Bath, a lot of them are taken over by private owners. We're thankfully being grateful enough to be able to be in Gay Street and have this centre in Bath whilst Jane was living here. She was very much inspired here by the social phenomenon. However, she did struggle. It wasn't her favourite place to live. She was very much inspired and more home felt and heartfelt back in the countryside of Hampshire where she grew up when she was a lot younger. And obviously her father passed away in Bath. He is buried in St Swithin's Church in the year of 1805. So 4 years living in Bath. She had a lot happen here. And obviously Bath was known to be a social phenomenon. So it was very much an affluent area as such.
And would Jane have been sociable herself? She writes a lot about the pump room.
She does write a lot about the pump room. Jane herself wasn't as much sociable. Within those times, we would have classed Jane now as to be a feminist. So her and her sister Cassandra, they used to enjoy sneaking into the balls. So they were very much like to go against what the woman in society would have been in those times. She wasn't sociable as much. She was very kept to herself. She was always seen holding little notelets, all parts of the books of her novels, drafts. So yes, very much, she wasn't as sociable as such as we would believe some of the more aristocratic of women to be within those times. She was very, very hidden away in herself, unlike with her sister Cassandra, but there was a different relationship.
Were there any similarities between Jane's real life and her writing?
Very much so. So Jane very much was inspired to take a lot of her personal life into her novels. So predominantly Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice are probably two of the most well known for Jane's life, and especially a lot of her brothers were very much inspired by a lot of the characters, Henry Tilney, characters in Emma and Mansfield Park, and she based herself on Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice and her sister Cassandra off of Jane Bennet, Pride and Prejudice. So they're the most affluent ones that Jane based her personal life within the novels themselves.
Thank you so much. And now we
Pleasure.
know more about Jane's life in Bath. Let's take a look at the end of her story.
Jane moved from Bath in 1806 to Chawton, where she stayed until her illness got worse. From there, she moved to Winchester to be closer to her doctor. Jane lived a very quiet life with her sister, who was also unmarried, and in 1817, at the age of just 41, Jane died from her illness. 250 years on from Jane Austen's birth, and her novels have rarely been out of print. There have been over 30 adaptations of Austen's novels for the screen, and she remains one of Britain's most famous authors, and we don't think that will change anytime soon. We've had a great time exploring Bath and learning more about Jane's time here, with thanks to our experts along the way. We're going to leave you with a quote from Jane herself. "The person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. And that being said, we think you should go off and enjoy a good book."